Ready.
Just waiting for Wendy. Hello, everyone, and welcome today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I think that on a day when we're making an announcement like the one we're making today, that's a particularly important thing to acknowledge. But also, it's an important day for us to note the passing of Senator Murray Sinclair. He had such an important role that he played in exposing the truth of our history as part of, with the residential schools, as part of the commission. And I'll say on a personal note, he was also such a strong champion for animals and was really a strong champion when it came to protecting cetaceans, what that being whales and dolphins, from captivity. So just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge his passing. My name is Julie Dabrusin. Je suis la secrétaire parlementaire du ministre de l'Environnement et Changement climatique et du ministre de l'Énergie et Ressources naturelles. Today's important because when I think about when I decided to run, one of the reasons was that I was concerned about strong and healthy communities, about protecting our natural spaces, and about the environment. So at that time, before we formed our Liberal government, environmental protections had been gutted by the previous Harper Poilievre government, and that included muzzling government scientists. And at that time, most importantly, when we're talking about what we're talking about today, under the previous Conservative government, our emissions were rising, and there was actually no path to see how we could transform our economy to a strong, clean, and competitive economy. That's not the world that I wanted for my kids or our country's next generation to grow up in. And that's why the work that we have been doing on the environment and the economy is so important. Notre gouvernement a aidé les Canadiens et les Canadiennes à passer du mazout domestique très polluant aux pompes à chaleur. Nous avons interdit les plastiques à usage unique, les plus courantes, afin que nos plages, nos lacs et nos rivières soient exemptes de plastique. Nous avons investi dans les énergies renouvelables et propres et historiquement, nous sommes le gouvernement qui a investi le plus en transport en commun. These efforts have been paying off. For the first time in Canadian history, we're bending that curve. Our emissions are down, interest rates are down, inflation is down, unemployment is down, and the economy is growing, with the creation of 183,000 jobs in the last year in Ontario alone. We owe it to young Canadians to keep working for them. And as I stand here before you today, I fear that all of that progress on emissions, on a strong, clean, competitive economy would be lost if Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives formed government. Young Canadians are concerned about their future, and today we're talking about an important work that our government is doing, our government plan that will protect future generations and create jobs, protect the environment, and support workers across the country. Les différentes communautés à travers le pays voient les opportunités créées par l'action climatique. Les jeunes de tout le pays ont été clairs. Face aux incendies, aux inondations et aux vagues de chaleur, le gouvernement doit agir. Ils veulent une action réelle de notre part et en tant que dirigeants politiques et en tant que parents, nous leur devons d'agir. Je vais donner la parole au ministre Guilbeault, suivi du ministre Wilkinson et finalement le ministre Boissonnault. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Julie. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Très heureux d'être accompagné de plusieurs de mes collègues députés qui sont ici avec nous, les ministres Wilkinson et Boissonnault. Merci, Julie, pour ton introduction. Alors, j'entends moi aussi des jeunes de partout au pays, mes enfants, les amis de mes enfants, qui sont très inquiets quant à leur futur et qui veulent nous voir travailler ensemble pour bâtir un avenir meilleur. 2.5 years ago, we launched the most comprehensive climate plan in our country's history. Every sector, every region, every measure, every investment. And our vision was simple: healthier communities, good jobs in a cleaner, stronger economy. And as Julie said, it's working. Our pollution levels are down while the economy is running at full steam. Mais les changements climatiques touchent déjà tout le monde. L'ensemble de nos communautés, partout au pays, subissent déjà les impacts des changements climatiques. Cette année, j'ai pu discuter avec plusieurs personnes qui ont été touchées par les sécheresses, les vagues de chaleur, les inondations et les feux de forêt. Et comme vous le savez, 2024 a établi un nouveau record: 7 milliards de dommages assurables seulement pour les mois de juillet et août, ce qui en fait déjà l'année la plus dispendieuse de l'histoire de notre pays. Et la science est claire: la pollution doit diminuer rapidement et significativement. And we should all be driving toward the same goal: safe, prosperous, healthy future for all. And every sector must do its part. Oil and gas companies are no exception. Canada's oil and gas sector account for almost a third of our climate pollution, more than double combined pollution from all other heavy and light industries. And the oil and gas sector has also been experiencing record profits. Those profits have grown tenfold since the pandemic, going from $6.6 billion to $66 billion. So we're asking the oil and gas sector to invest their record profits into pollution-cutting projects that can create and keep good jobs. Canadians can be proud of hundreds of thousands of oil and gas workers leading on transformative new technologies. The tools are here to cut pollution, and across the world there is a consensus on the need to transition to a cleaner future. Now is the window of opportunity. And so I'm proud to introduce Canada's draft regulations to cap pollution from the oil and gas sector. Those regulations will help to cut pollution by 35% below 2019 levels, while providing compliance flexibility. In doing so, we will create a cap-and-trade system for the sector. It will reward low-polluting facilities and incentivize higher-polluting facilities to invest. So what this means, it means no matter what happens to production, the pollution level will go down. And let me be clear, this was carefully designed through rigorous consultations. It goes after pollution, not production. Close analysis we've worked closely to develop what is technically feasible for the sector, but also to keep the industry accountable to their own promise that they've committed to be carbon neutral by 2050. And it's also a form of insurance for Canadians that with this policy, we will continue moving towards the achievement of our goals. It's part of a broad suite of measures, including the Canada Growth Fund, industrial pollution pricing, strengthening methane regulations, and new investment tax credits. We look forward to engaging with provinces, Indigenous nation, labour, and other stakeholders, and we aim to finalize these regulations next year. Alors, je suis très fier de présenter le projet de règlement pour plafonner les émissions de gaz à effet de serre du secteur du pétrole et du gaz, pour fixer ces niveaux de réduction à 35% sous les niveaux de 2019 d'ici 2030. C'est un système qui va permettre une certaine flexibilité aux entreprises. Ce faisant, nous allons créer un système de plafonnement et d'échange d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre spécifiquement pour le secteur du pétrole et du gaz. Le système va reconnaître les entreprises qui polluent peu et inciter les entreprises à plus forte pollution à investir et réduire leurs émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Et ce système va permettre de garantir que peu importe ce qui arrive avec la production, les émissions de gaz à effet de serre et la pollution vont diminuer. Nous allons rendre l'industrie responsable. Elle-même s'est engagée à atteindre la carboneutralité d'ici 2050. Alors, ce système va faire en sorte que nous allons y arriver. C'est en quelque sorte une assurance pour la population canadienne que nous allons atteindre les objectifs que nous nous sommes fixés. Vous savez, le secteur du pétrole représente près d'un tiers de notre pollution climatique et il doit faire sa juste part. C'est un secteur qui a connu une forte hausse de ses profits, qui ont augmenté de 10 fois par rapport à la pandémie, passant de 6,6 milliards à 66 milliards de dollars. Alors maintenant, ce que l'on demande de faire, c'est d'investir une partie de ces profits dans la décarbonation. Et je pense notamment aux travailleurs, parce que réinvestir les profits de ces entreprises dans l'innovation, c'est bon pour les travailleurs. Ça va créer des emplois et les garantir pour des générations futures. Les Canadiennes et les Canadiens comprennent. Pour la santé, pour la prospérité et pour l'avenir de nos enfants et de nos petits-enfants, C'est ce que nous devons faire. Aujourd'hui, nous faisons un pas en avant pour renforcer la compétitivité économique du Canada. Today, we're taking a big step forward for prosperity and energy security and for the future of our kids and grandkids. It's good for workers. Shovels in the ground will protect jobs for today and for decades to come. And federal financial support ensure companies give a fair payment for good union jobs. Success requires labor at the table through initiatives like the Sustainable Jobs Partnership Council that my colleagues here worked very hard on. And it's good for the environment to create a safe, secure, and healthy future for all Canadians. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and certainly thank you to all of the colleagues who have joined us here today. L'annonce aujourd'hui est importante pour l'environnement, mais détient aussi une importance immense pour la future prospérité économique du Canada. Over the last 9 years, Canada has taken aggressive action on climate change that has reversed a dangerous trajectory of upward emissions that we saw during the decade of inaction under Prime Minister Stephen Harper and the Conservative Party of Canada, a government in which Pierre Poilievre was a minister, and I would note that nothing we have heard or seen from Mr. Poilievre would suggest that he has changed at all or that he even believes in the science of climate change. Aujourd'hui, grâce au travail de ce gouvernement sur le dossier du climat, les émissions sont en train de baisser au Canada. While climate change is indeed causing environmental harm, it is also rapidly transforming the global economy and global finance in ways that are creating enormous economic opportunity for those that are thoughtful and focused. The global energy transformation is both an environmental imperative to protect the planet for future generations and an economic opportunity on a scale of the Industrial Revolution. Ce dont le Canada a besoin à ce moment de son histoire, c'est d'une stratégie environnementale et économique réfléchie et ambitieuse qui fasse le lien entre tous les éléments, une stratégie qui garantisse la prospérité et des emplois de qualité dans toutes les régions du pays. A strategy that is focused on key growth areas in which Canada has or can reasonably develop a comparative advantage in the world. Areas including critical minerals, hydrogen, carbon capture, renewable electricity, biofuels and biomass, batteries and electric vehicles, and nuclear technology. However, for a major oil and gas producing country like Canada, part of such an effective strategy must also lie in a thoughtful approach to the long-term competitiveness of Canada's oil and gas sector, a sector that has long been an important source of wealth and of well-paying jobs. For Canada's oil and gas sector, climate change is not just an environmental issue, it is a competitiveness issue. As the world moves to reduce emissions generated by the production and the combustion of fossil fuels, oil and gas extracted with the lowest production emissions will have value in the world. This is true both for combustion-related uses of oil and gas that will exist in smaller volumes as global demand declines over coming decades, but also for significant volumes of fossil fuels that are used in non-combustion applications, applications that do not affect the climate, so long as we produce oil and gas with ultra-low production emissions. Things like petrochemicals, solvents, waxes, asphalt, carbon graphite, hydrogen, and others. Une réduction agressive, précoce et ambitieuse des émissions liées à la production de gaz peut offrir un avantage concurrentiel significatif au secteur et à ses travailleurs. It will ensure that Canada is indeed where countries will look to buy resources that are developed with high labor and environmental standards and are low carbon. That is ethical oil. The Government of Canada has introduced incentives, regulations, and investments to encourage and support the oil and gas sector in pursuit of substantially reducing their emissions. These include investments from the Strategic Innovation Fund, the Clean Fuels Fund, the investment tax credits for carbon capture and sequestration and for the production of low-carbon hydrogen. The cap being announced today is a cap on emissions, not on production. And in fact, folks will see that we expect production levels of both oil and gas to grow over the next few years until global demand declines. Folks should keep this in mind when we hear the predictable, wild claims that will almost certainly come from Premiers Moe and Premier Premier Smith. Pour définir le plafond, nous avons travaillé avec des experts pour déterminer quel niveau de réduction d'émissions sera techniquement réalistique d'ici 2030. The vast majority of anticipated emissions reductions under the cap actually come from two areas. Methane reductions of 75%, which is something that we have signaled a number of times in the past, and something that Premier Smith herself, when she developed her climate plan with Sonia Savage before the last Alberta election, said was a good idea. Emissions reductions from the oil sands that the companies themselves have said are feasible. Once again, something Premier Smith has supported. And I would encourage folks in the media to ask Premier Smith about both of those issues. Vous vous souviendrez que nous avons publié un cadre provisoire pour la plateforme il y a environ 11 mois. Depuis lors, nous avons mené des consultations. Le projet réglementaire présenté aujourd'hui intègre les commentaires reçus au cours de ces conversations. A thoughtful plan to reduce carbon emissions in the oil and gas sector on a path to net zero by 2050 will help to secure the long-term competitiveness of the industry while creating well-paying jobs for Canadians. It will ensure businesses and folks who work, the 400,000 workers who work in the oil and gas sector, will have continued opportunity. The cap itself, along with other federal initiatives, will drive the need for thousands of skilled workers to build and operate decarbonization technologies and infrastructure projects. Projects like Dow's recently announced $12 billion net zero petrochemical facility that will create 6,000 construction jobs. The recently announced large-scale hydrogen production plants of both Linde and Air Products. Strathcona's recently announced plans to implement a major carbon capture system in the oil sands, and Shell's Polaris project, similarly a carbon capture project. Ladies and gentlemen, we can choose to lead by recognizing where the world is heading and aggressively pursuing decarbonization and diversification initiatives to enable major areas of economic opportunity. Or we can bury our heads in the sand. We can pretend the world is not moving towards a cleaner future, eroding our competitiveness, our long-term prosperity, and our jobs. This is unfortunately the approach that has been chosen by Mr. Poilievre and the Conservative Party. Mr. Poilievre quite literally tells us that he has no plan for the environment. And without a plan to ensure a healthy environment, he truly has no relevant plan for a prosperous economy of the future. Canada has been and must continue to be a reliable supplier of energy and technology to the world. This federal government's focus on decarbonizing Canada's oil and gas sector is both a plan to protect the planet for future generations and to enhance the short and long-term competitiveness of the industry. For both the economy and the environment, we must act, and today we are.
Well, merci beaucoup, Jonathan, and thank you very much, Stephen. So Leah, Lloyd, Julie, Adam, Patrick, colleagues, thank you for being here today. You know, I want to echo what Jonathan and Stephen have talked about. There's been a lot of talk about what this cap means for Alberta, for oil and gas, for workers, and for the future of the country, for affordability. And I'm sure you're going to hear even more about it from my province today. So let me do my part as the Alberta Minister to set the record straight. This cap is a cap on emissions, not a cap on production, full stop. En français, c'est un plafonnement sur les émissions à gaz à effet de serre, pas sur les questions de production dans le secteur pétrolier. C'est critique. C'est un engin économique pour le Canada. Nous sommes un des producteurs de l'huile et gaz et du pétrole le plus important dans le monde. Et j'aimerais féliciter Stephen et Jonathan pour avoir écouté le secteur, écouté les gens qui auraient pensé que cette journée aurait jamais été possible. So Jonathan and Stephen, thank you for the work that you did to listen, to work with people in the sector, to work with officials across this country to get to where we are today. And under this plan, production is going to increase, as Jonathan said, to meet global demand. And then if we see that peak in the future, it'll taper off. But look, friends, I'm from Alberta, and I have people from the oil and gas sector come and talk to me, and they say, we know we need to change. We know we need to have the greenest barrel of oil on the planet, because who's going to want to buy that? The answer is everyone. And who's going to finance that? Capital markets. Why? because climate change is real. And the Pierre Poilievre Conservatives and the Danielle Smith gang that got together this weekend in Red Deer simply don't believe it. And they're quite fine to let the planet burn. Well, as ministerial lead for Jasper, I'm not fine with that. None of my colleagues here are fine with that. Whether it's atmospheric rivers in British Columbia, whether it is fires in Lytton, whether it is what we saw in Fiona, the climate change imperative is real. And I'm saying this as an Edmonton Centre MP. And when I knocked doors in the middle of the climate change, in the middle of COVID, what was the #1 thing that residents of Edmonton Centre asked me to do in the middle of a global pandemic? Fight climate change. Make sure that we have a planet for our kids and grandkids. We know where you're going to get us through with vaccines, but you have to deal with this crisis. And what Jonathan and Stephen, colleagues behind me today, and our government is doing is responding to that call. Now let's talk numbers. Jonathan mentioned some of the projects, $2 billion for Saskatchewan and Alberta right now with CGF and Strathcona Resources. $1.8 billion and 5,200 jobs to clean up orphan and abandoned wells just in Alberta. $960 million from my department for jobs for the Sectoral Workforce Solutions Program to give work to more than 500,000 people in the energy sector for the years to come. This is about a moment in time, my friends. This is about embracing the economy. It's about embracing what we have to do for the environment. And look, we didn't even put numbers on carbon capture, use, and storage yet. Just to Alberta alone, we're talking over $20 billion in investments to make sure that we have the greenest hydrogen in the prairies, that we have net zero cement, that we are taking a leadership role. And today, we're making sure that we do that for the long term. My friends, I can't say it enough. And I want to thank Stephen and his work in the department and our government. Emissions are finally on the decline for the first time in 25 years. And thanks to the Canada Carbon Rebate, we're lowering emissions while putting more money into the pockets of Albertans. When I'm on the door, you know what people tell me? They say, don't tell anyone, but we got our checks. We got our Canada, like, I can't tell our neighbors, but I don't know how much they're getting, but we know how much we're getting, and we know that we get it every 3 months. And now, like, it's real. People are seeing it. They get what we're trying to do. So, look, I have no shortage of ambition for this country. My colleagues here want us to grow, and we have to do it in a way that we not just make our obligations to our kids and our grandkids, but that we do what is right for the world. And look, I will say this to each and every Albertan who works in this sector watching us today: your ingenuity and your innovation are what is going to get us to where we need to be as a planet. Je suis fier de vous. Je sais que vous avez ce que nous avons besoin de vous pour nous amener avec ce plafonnement sur les émissions, pas sur la production, because Alberta workers and Canadian workers are going to be at the heart of this plan. Merci. Thank you.
We'll now take questions from the room first, and then we'll go to the conference line. Ça maintenant prendre les questions. Donc, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Davis Legree, iPolitics. Minister Guilbeault, these are just draft regulations at the end of the day, and your government is operating in an increasingly tenuous minority parliament, and ECCC has a tendency to be delayed in its policy rollout. I'm wondering, considering all that, how confident are you that this cap will actually ever see the light of day?
I think I would rephrase part of your question. These are not just draft regulations. Look around the world. No other major oil and gas producer is doing what we're doing. The United States, the United Kingdom, Norway, the Gulf states. We're the only large oil and gas producer in the world to do this. And in terms of, I mean, we needed to get this right. And it's important to do the consultations and to do the technical work that both Jonathan and Randy have referred to show that what we're asking the sector to do is technically feasible in terms of emission reduction. We can turn this around quickly. I mean, we've actually, if you look at the clean fuel regulations, it took more than 5 years to adopt this regulation. We're now down to about 2.5 years, to 2 to 2.5 years to adopt our regulation. But as I said, we will be ready in 2025 to present the final regulations.
And just as a follow-up, I'm not sure if you've seen the big light-up truck going around Ottawa recently, but I was wondering...
If only it was electric.
I did wonder what you make of Alberta's Scrap the Cap campaign that they've launched in response to this proposed policy.
I think Randy said it more eloquently than I could ever. You know, it's more hot air and disinformation. on the part of the conservative movement in Canada, whether it's Pierre Poilievre, whether it's Danielle Smith, whether it's Scott Moe, pretending that climate change isn't happening in the face of mounting climate impacts and dramatic impacts on the lives of Canadians, but also cost to the Canadian economy. They will continue doing stupid things, and we will continue focusing on helping Canadians to create a robust economy, good jobs, and work to protect the environment.
Émilie Bergeron, la presse canadienne. Monsieur Guilbeault, un règlement, ça peut toujours être abrogé par un futur gouvernement autre. Alors, quelle garantie vous avez aujourd'hui que M. Poilievre, s'il prend le pouvoir, ne va pas mettre ça à la poubelle? Et finalement, est-ce qu'on a autre chose aujourd'hui qu'une annonce de campagne électorale?
Bien, dans une société démocratique, tout gouvernement dûment élu a le droit et la capacité de faire les choses qu'il a envie de faire et à la limite de défaire ce que le gouvernement ou les gouvernements précédents ont fait. C'est comme ça que ça fonctionne en démocratie. Quelle garantie je peux vous offrir? Bien, la meilleure garantie pour que Pierre Poilievre ne défasse pas tout ce que nous avons fait en environnement, c'est de réélire le Parti libéral. C'est la meilleure façon de faire. Regardez autour du pays ce qui se passe présentement. Nous sommes le seul gouvernement qui maintient le cap en matière de lutte au changement climatique, que ce soit sur la tarification carbone, ce que nous annonçons aujourd'hui. Dans quelques semaines, nous allons présenter le règlement final sur l'électricité propre. Je parlais de la norme sur les carburants propres plus tôt, la norme zéro émission. Nous en avons fait plus que tout autre gouvernement dans l'histoire du pays et notre intention, c'est de continuer à le faire.
Avec cette annonce-là, vous êtes 2 ans en retard sur votre propre échéance que vous étiez donnée ou votre propre agenda de planification pour ce plafond. Ça entrerait en vigueur finalement qu'en 2030. Donc, pourquoi ça prend autant de temps? Puis, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas urgence d'agir?
En fait, on n'a pas proposé de mettre en place ce système-là en 2022. J'arrivais en 2022 comme ministre de l'Environnement. Nous avons annoncé notre intention de faire ça dans la dernière campagne électorale. Et comme je le disais, nous sommes le seul pays au monde, en termes de grands producteurs de pétrole et de gaz, à mettre en place une mesure comme ça. Ni les États-Unis, ni la Grande-Bretagne, ni la Norvège, ni les pays producteurs dans le Golfe, par exemple, bien que certains d'entre eux ont applaudi cette mesure-là, ils ne l'ont pas mise en place. Et je tiens à vous corriger, là, la réglementation va s'appliquer à partir du 1er janvier 2026. Alors, c'est là où la réglementation commence à s'appliquer en termes de tout ce qui est conformité, transparence, tout ça. Le système va se mettre en place, mais ça commence le 1er janvier 2026. Merci.
Oui, justement, Hélène. Oui, justement, là-dessus, M. Guilbeault, sur 2026. Donc, ce qu'on nous expliquait tout à l'heure, la séance d'information, c'est qu'on commence à enregistrer le nombre d'émissions en 2026, 2027, 2028, puis j'imagine on fait une sorte de moyenne, puis on descend 27 en bas de ça pour fixer le plafond ou la norme. Ma question, c'est pourquoi utiliser des années aussi tardives alors qu'on sait que depuis plusieurs années, les émissions augmentent? Pourquoi pas avoir choisi des années d'abord pour lesquelles on a déjà les quantités d'émissions et qui auraient été évidemment inférieures?
Bien, vous vous souviendrez, l'an passé, dans le document de référence que nous avons publié sur le plafonnement, on estimait à ce moment-là que les réductions d'émissions seraient de l'ordre de 35 à 38 %. On est à 35 %. Donc, on est pas mal dans la fourchette qu'on avait prévue. Pourquoi attendre? Écoutez, il y a un tiers des installations pour lesquelles nous n'avons pas de données présentement. Alors, il faut accumuler ces données-là. On a les données pour les plus grandes centrales, mais les plus petites, donc il y a un tiers de ces entreprises-là pour lesquelles on n'a pas les données. Donc, il faut construire toute la base de données pour faire ça. Mais encore une fois, si vous êtes une entreprise, vous ne pouvez pas attendre en 2029 pour commencer à mettre en place des mesures alors que votre première période de conformité va être en 2030. Ça ne marchera pas. Et on le voit, Jonathan a mentionné certaines entreprises, Strathcona, Suncor, qui ont déjà commencé à mettre de l'avant. Donc, les plus proactifs dans le secteur voient ça venir depuis un bout de temps et ont commencé à faire leurs investissements. Et ce que la réglementation va permettre de faire, c'est que l'ensemble des acteurs du secteur agissent pour réduire leur niveau de pollution.
Juste une précision sur ce 35 %-là, je pense que c'est par rapport à 2019. Je ne sais pas ce que ça veut dire par rapport à 2005. Je ne sais pas si vous avez les chiffres, mais Je vais juste enfiler ma deuxième.
Votre sous-question.
Ouais, voilà. Mais de manière générale, qu'est-ce que l'annonce d'aujourd'hui permet d'accomplir en termes d'atteinte de l'objectif de réduction de 40 à 45 %? Est-ce que cette annonce d'aujourd'hui permet de dire on réussit?
Bien, si vous regardez, par exemple, l'analyse indépendante qui a été faite par l'Institut du climat du Canada, ils ont spécifié qu'il y a un certain nombre de choses qu'on devait faire pour être en mesure d'atteindre les objectifs. Le plafond n'est pas le seul, mais c'est un des gros morceaux. Il y a le règlement sur le méthane. Jonathan en a parlé tout à l'heure. On finalise un règlement sur la réduction des émissions de méthane du secteur du pétrole et du gaz, où les entreprises devront réduire d'au moins 75 % d'ici 2030. C'est l'objectif de réduction de méthane pour le secteur le plus ambitieux sur la planète. Et l'autre gros morceau, c'est évidemment le réseau électrique carboneutre. On a déjà présenté l'an passé le projet de règlement. Le règlement final s'en vient dans quelques semaines.
Just really quick reminder to introduce yourselves and your outlet. Veuillez, s'il vous plaît, vous introduire et votre média, s'il vous plaît.
Judy Trin, CTV News. This pollution cap does not take effect until 2030, yet you have committed, the federal government has committed to the Paris Agreement to reduce overall emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030. Is this not jeopardizing your own commitment to an international treaty? Because the production cap or the pollution cap is not as aggressive as it should be.
So two things I want to say on that. First, the regulations will enter into force January 1st, 2026, and that's when it starts, not in 2030, number one. Number two, the work that Jonathan was talking earlier about the technical analysis we did to show that what we're proposing is technically feasible in the sector. As you know, the use of natural resources is, per our Constitution, a provincial jurisdiction. And we can't do through the back door what we can't do through the front door. So we can't go after the production. So we had to show that what we're proposing is technically feasible. And after months and months of hard work between our departments, with industry, with experts, this is what we came to in terms of conclusion. So 35% reduction under 2019 levels. It is a very important element of our plan. It's not the only one. If you look at the latest analysis from the independent organization, the Canadian Climate Institute, they say that if we put in place the cap, if we put in place the clean electricity standards, the final regulations will be published in a couple of weeks, methane regulations by 2030, Canada has a fair shot at meeting our 2030 targets. It's the first time in the history of our country that emissions are going down while the economy is running full steam ahead. It's never happened before, unless it was because of COVID, financial crisis, economic recession. But our emissions are at their lowest point in 25 years. Our plan is working. Now, we can't stop here. We have to do more, and that's exactly what we're doing.
I want to clarify that. Under the technical briefing we just had, we were told that in 2026 is when the companies start registering, but they are not going to actually put in the cap and abide by the cap until 2030.
No. The first reporting period is 2030. If you look at other cap-and-trade system around the world, you could look at Quebec, California, 3 years reporting period are common in these systems because you don't want to report specifically just on 1 year if something unusual happens that year, either very high level of production or very low level of production. So you want to tend to have a bit of an average for that. But the regulations start on January 1st, 2026. And if you're a company, you can't wait until 2030 to start reducing your emissions and have regulatory obligations to meet. It'll be literally impossible to do that. So companies like Suncor and Strathcona are already making investment because they know that this is coming. And what we will see with those regulations is that the rest of the companies and the sector will make those investments to ensure that they can comply. But you can't wait until the very end of the first period to do that.
Maybe just one addition. Look, the oil and gas sector represents 31% of Canada's emissions. Canada cannot achieve its climate targets of 40 to 45% reductions if the oil and gas sector does not make a contribution, in the same way that we expect the transportation sector, in the same way that we expect heavy industry, in the same way that we expect the building sector. This will actually ensure that the oil and gas sector makes a contribution to the achievement of the 40 to 45% reductions in 2030. And it is done on the basis, as Stephen said, of technical feasibility. At the end of the day, as I said in my remarks, there are really two major areas where we expect to see large-scale reductions. One is 75% methane reduction, which the technology will have to be implemented such that we've achieved that by 2030, and that technology is well understood and it's actually not that expensive. And the implementation of systems, including carbon capture in the oil sands, to ensure that we are holding the Pathways folks and others to their word about what they can achieve with respect to reductions. So it is critically important, but it is also critically important, as I said in a number of parts of the remarks, that for the long-term competitiveness of the sector, and you go talk to any of the Pathway CEOs, they know they must decarbonize. For access to capital, they know they must decarbonize. This is essentially a backstop to ensure they do what they say they can.
Bonjour, Valérie Gamache de Radio-Canada. Monsieur Guilbeault, vous et vos collègues avaient répété là, que Monsieur Poilievre n'a pas de plan, qu'il nie les changements, qu'il ne croit pas au changement climatique. Il y a Donald Trump aussi qui, lui, parle d'un canular et veut se retirer de l'accord de Paris. À quel point aujourd'hui craignez-vous les résultats de l'élection américaine de demain et un possible retour de Donald Trump à la Maison-Blanche?
D'abord, je dirais deux choses. C'est aux Américains et aux Américaines de décider qui sera leur prochain président ou présidente. C'est certainement pas à moi de me prononcer là-dessus. La deuxième chose que je dirais, si vous regardez, par exemple, les investissements qui ont été faits par l'administration actuelle, notamment à travers l'Inflation Reduction Act, l'IRA, il y a énormément, en fait, la majorité de ces investissements-là, de la création d'emplois, sont faits dans des États républicains, donc dans des États rouges. Et moi, je pense que peu importe ce qui va arriver demain et qui occupera la chaise à la Maison-Blanche, il va y avoir énormément de pression de part et d'autre, tant républicaine que démocrate, pour que ces investissements-là se poursuivent, soient maintenus et se poursuivent. Et le plan de réduction des États-Unis repose énormément sur l'IRA. Donc, moi, j'ai bon espoir que les États-Unis vont continuer d'aller de l'avant en matière de lutte au changement climatique, peu importe le résultat de l'élection demain.
Et d'un point de vue mondial, si les États-Unis ne sont pas autour de la table pour en parler, là, par exemple s'ils se retiraient de l'accord de Paris, à quel point ces discussions-là ont encore du sens ou servent à quelque chose?
Évidemment, le Forum des Nations unies est un forum imparfait dans un monde imparfait. Et la lutte au changement climatique fonctionne beaucoup mieux quand tout le monde est autour de la table. On a déjà eu des scénarios où les États-Unis n'ont jamais ratifié le protocole de Kyoto, par exemple. On a continué d'avancer là-dessus. Le Canada est le seul pays au monde, le seul à s'être retiré. Donc, les États-Unis ne l'ont jamais ratifié, mais nous sommes le seul qui l'avions ratifié et à nous en être retirés. On a continué malgré tout, en travaillant avec les provinces, avec les municipalités au Canada, à maintenir l'action climatique en vie et à trouver des façons de travailler avec nos partenaires internationaux. Alors, encore une fois, c'est à la population américaine de décider, mais on trouvera des façons de s'adapter en fonction du résultat.
Ian Wood, CBC News. Ministers, I want to ask you about capture technology. You mentioned methane capturing and carbon capturing, but on carbon capture technology, it hasn't been done at a large scale, deployed at a large scale yet. So why are you confident that this technology that hasn't done such a scale is going to be what takes you to neutrality?
Well, I guess I would say a few things to that. The first is, as we actually progress to address climate change, technology is very important. That's true in transportation with electric and hydrogen vehicles. That's true in buildings with respect to envelopes and heat pumps. That's true across the board. One technology that is important in the context of the decarbonization, not just of the oil sector, but of a lot of heavy industry, including cement and steel, is carbon capture. Carbon capture actually is well understood and has been used for decades at smaller scale. So it's not like a brand new technology, although some implementations are newer and more novel. The issue has been scale, and it has been cost reduction. And we have now seen, over the course of the past while, carbon capture technologies at scale that work. And the Shell project in Alberta is a good example of that. We are seeing the scale up of these systems around the world, and I would tell you that the recent announcement by Shell on the Polaris project and Strathcona on their own CCUS project would tell you that they believe that from an economic perspective, it is now ready for prime time.
And just...
Oh, sure.
Just to add to what Jonathan was saying, if you look at our last national inventory report, you will see that there is 7 million tons of carbon that was sequestered in that period, which is the almost equivalent of 10% of Quebec's overall emission. So we're not saying that carbon capture is going to solve our climate change problem, but it is part of the equation. And if you look at many of, whether it's the International Energy Agency or the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, they both refer to carbon capture and general carbon management technologies as essential technologies to reach our 2050 goals.
And I just want to ask on an economic front here. A lot of Canadians are struggling right now. The economy might be booming along, as you say, but people are living paycheck to paycheck. Debt levels are up. Various business groups, Conference Board of Canada, the Business Council of Canada, they've both not warned, but they've had concerns about this plan. What do you say to Canadians who are struggling right now and they might see this as another economic burden on them?
So I guess I would say a couple things. Certainly Canadians are struggling. The impacts of a lot of the supply chain disruptions coming out of COVID, saw inflation spike, which has created affordability challenges for many Canadians, and then the increase in interest rates to try to control inflation have also created challenges. That is something we have obviously been working very hard to address. We are now seeing inflation back at 1.6%. We are seeing interest rates coming down, but it's going to take some time. I would, though, say, I guess, two different things to the argument, and I know Premier Smith has made this argument. Any reasonable person who understands economics would tell you this is not actually going to affect the price of oil and gas that people pay. Those are world prices, by and large, particularly for oil. And if you go and talk to an economist like Trevor Toombs, he would tell you that that assertion is absurd. In terms of the Conference Board and the Deloitte reports, first of all, they were modeling something that they actually didn't have, so there was no, we had not actually published the regulation. But they also assume in some of those analyses things like the oil and gas companies will not do anything to reduce their emissions and therefore it will affect production. I don't think that the oil and gas CEOs are that dumb. I mean, at the end of the day, they are going to put in place the measures they need to continue to actually produce products, and they are going to actually be strengthened by the way that they do that. We are going to enable them to enhance their competitiveness on a go-forward basis. So, if I was somebody who was actually a university professor grading some of those reports, they would get a failing grade because they actually are based on just ludicrous assumptions. And we are certainly, and I am certain, and I'm sure Stephen is certainly happy to sit down with the Conference Board and to walk them through that.
I mean, no, go ahead. No. There's a whole section of my speech that I didn't read because I was talking to the gallery. We bought a pipeline, and that pipeline is now it's literally getting oil to the world. Why do I say that? Because it's tens of thousands of jobs. And when I talk to union workers who worked on TMX, they thank our government for giving them those years of work. And I can tell you it's part of what was factored into the caps that we're seeing here today. But look, we're talking just in air products, just in Dow alone, tens of thousands of jobs. What's the best hedge against people who are struggling? It's a really good long-term paying job, because those jobs then actually turn the whole ecosystem of economic development, not just in the Alberta heartland, but in Edmonton, in Fort McMurray, in Red Deer, across the whole province. It stimulates housing development. In my city, we've got 60% year-over-year increase in housing starts. Edmonton's got 2.5% of the housing starts, and at 6.5% of the housing starts, and we're 2.5% of the population. Like, something is going on because of the tens of billions of dollars, not just that our government is investing, but that companies are investing. And guess what? Carbon capture, use, and storage is an area where we agree with the provincial government. And when it comes to hydrogen, it's an area of common ground with the hydrogen. So despite the fact that CPC MPs are handing out the Alberta government's talking points about today's caps, showing that Pierre and Danielle are very linked, there are ways that we can get this done and make sure that people can pay their bills at the end of the month.
I'll add one last thing. I mean, industry doesn't like regulations. I've been doing this for, I mean, not in politics, but working on environmental issues for over 3 decades. And I've never seen industry welcome any regulation that the government has put in place on an environmental issue. I could give you so many examples of fear-mongering, but I'll just give you one. When the Quebec government, and you could talk to your Quebec colleagues about that, they would probably remember, when Quebec government unanimously adopted zero-emission vehicle standards in 2017, I believe, maybe 2018. There's a very large North American auto manufacturer that was going around town telling people that if we did that, Quebecers wouldn't be able to buy internal combustion engine anymore. That'd be it. Here we are 6 or 7 years later, and the sky hasn't fallen, and Quebecers are still, they're buying lots of EVs. 25%, according to the latest inventory of new sales, are EVs. 75% are not EVs. Quebecers can still buy internal combustion engine. So those doom and gloom scenarios from industry have, as Jonathan said, very little credibility with all of us, and they should have very little credibility with you as well.
We've got about 5 minutes left for questions. If you could keep it to 1, that would be great. On a à peu près 5 minutes pour des questions. Merci.
Hi, Jillian Piper, Global News. Minister Guilbeault, you just said Danielle Smith and Scott Moe do, quote, stupid things, unquote. How confident are you that you can get Alberta and Saskatchewan to comply with these regulations, given that you just called them stupid?
I didn't call them stupid. I said they were doing stupid things. There's a difference. Number one, and number two, I mean, it's not optional to comply with federal regulations, and it's not the provinces that will have to comply. It's the companies in those provinces that will have to comply.
You just said industry doesn't like regulations, and that you've had some difficulty in the past. How confident are you that you can enforce these regulations and make sure that they comply? Well,
if facing difficulties was a criteria not to do something in our business, I don't know what we would do. Probably not a whole lot. Difficult things are difficult, and fighting climate change is difficult, and it takes political courage. And I'm proud to be part of a group of people who believe strongly that we need to do that for the future of our kids and grandkids, for the future of jobs, for the future of the economy. This is the right thing to do.
And just one quick thing. I mean, look, back when we put in the methane regulations to require 40% reductions in methane, the industry said we shouldn't do it. At the end of the day, they have accomplished it, and we've actually done it in partnership with the provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta, who we signed equivalency agreements with. Those have been accomplished. They've been accomplished actually at very low cost. At the end of the day, we are talking about a higher level of methane reduction with technologies that are well understood. We are talking about reducing emissions in the oil sands on the basis of numbers that the Pathways CEOs themselves say they can do and that they say is required to enhance their own overall competitiveness. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's not just us. Industry knows they need to move, and history would tell you on the basis of the methane regs that the provinces will comply, and in fact, they actually may collaborate and do it themselves.
Boris Pro, Le Devoir. Monsieur Guilbeault, le Canada s'est engagé dans les cibles de Paris qui dit 30% de réduction des GES d'ici 2030 par rapport au niveau de 2005.
40 à 45%.
C'était pas l'engagement du Canada par rapport au niveau 2019, le niveau de Paris qui est basé par rapport au cible de 2005. Ma question est, ce que vous annoncez aujourd'hui fait combien de réduction par rapport à 2005? Pour le...
je ne l'ai pas sous les yeux, mais on peut vous sortir le chiffre, on vous l'enverra sans problème.
Vous n'avez pas demandé ça à vos fonctionnaires juste pour être sûr que ça soit cohérent avec l'objectif de Paris?
Écoutez, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, et si vous regardez notre plan de réduction qui a été présenté il y a 2 ans et demi, il n'y a pas d'objectif sectoriel pour le transport, l'industrie, le bâtiment ou la production de pétrole et de gaz. Ce qu'on a fait, c'est qu'on a regardé là où on pouvait faire les réductions d'émissions, qu'est-ce qui était techniquement faisable dans les différents secteurs, mais les cibles, ce ne sont pas des cibles sectorielles, mais les objectifs ne sont pas les mêmes en fonction de la capacité de différents secteurs. Donc, par exemple, dans la production d'électricité, on voit une réduction d'émissions qui va bien au-delà de nos objectifs de 2030 parce qu'on est en train d'éliminer la production de charbon, la production d'électricité au charbon. On prévoit de moins en moins de gaz, de plus en plus de renouvelables. Donc, ce secteur-là décarbonise beaucoup plus rapidement. On voit la même chose du côté de l'aluminium, par exemple. L'acier, on anticipe des réductions importantes, mais l'agriculture, ça va être plus long. Si vous regardez les cibles dans le secteur, les objectifs pour le secteur de l'agriculture sont beaucoup moindres que les objectifs du secteur du pétrole et du gaz parce que c'est plus compliqué de réduire dans ce secteur-là. Donc, je vous renverrai notre plan de 2022 qui démontre très bien, et on est très près de l'objectif qu'on avait mis pour le secteur du pétrole et du gaz dans ce plan-là.
il y a certaines analyses du GIEC, par exemple, qui disent que ça prendrait des réductions de 50 par rapport au niveau de 2019. Est-ce que c'est une admission que le secteur du pétrole et du gaz ne fera pas ce qu'il faut pour laisser le changement climatique à moins d'1,5 degré?
Bien, en fait, le dernier rapport du GIEC dit qu'on doit, en 2030, on doit être autour de 43 de réduction d'émissions. Notre cible, c'est de 40 à 45. Alors, on est pas mal dans la cible du GIEC. Et encore une fois, moi, je peux pas faire en sorte que la réglementation va forcer des réductions de production. Si on faisait ça, on va perdre devant les tribunaux et ça sert les intérêts de personne. Alors, on a fait une analyse de ce qui était techniquement faisable en termes de réduction d'émissions sans affecter la production et c'est avec ça c'est ce qu'on propose. C'est un projet de règlement et c'est là-dessus qu'on va discuter au cours des prochains mois.
Okay, sorry, that's all for today.
Maybe one, two.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mr. Just one quick one, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Minister Guilbeault, Michel Comte with Agence France-Presse. Very quickly, the cap-and-trade system for the oil and gas sector, do you envision it being a standalone or connecting, linking up with, say, Quebec's cap-and-trade, or is it California, I believe, that also has a cap-and-trade?
Quebec and California, they have an economy-wide system, and no, we're not envisioning that we would link the system with the Quebec-California system.
Thanks, I just wanted
Thank
to
you.
clarify that.
Campbell?
Campbell Clark from the Globe and Mail. So I've heard people talk here today about JASPER, for example, and the effects that climate change has on Canada. I've heard your opponents say that global greenhouse emissions are what causes those impacts, not just Canadian emissions, and that Canadian emissions are a small part of those global emissions, and therefore, I know you're lining up for this, and therefore you're putting unnecessary constraints on the Canadian economy that won't have a major impact on what happens here in Canada. So please, can you answer that? I know you want to.
So I would say that argument is the refuge of the climate denier, and anybody who says that actually doesn't think climate change is an important enough issue to address. But I would also say Canada is the 11th largest in the world in terms of absolute emissions and per capita emissions, and in the OECD we are number 2 in terms of per capita emissions. So anybody who says Canada is not a major contributor to climate change is simply either they are either lying or they simply are very ill-informed. At the end of the day, this is a collective action problem. Collective action problems are the most difficult things to solve. We need to ensure that all major emitters, and that includes Canada, are doing their part to address what is an existential threat to the future of the human race. And I would just say, concurrent with that is, I'm actually a business guy. I'm interested in actually having a competitive environment going forward, a competitive sector going forward that is going to be profitable during the transition and after, and that is what this does.
In the same vein, I've heard...
Sorry, we're going to have to cut it off.
Right. In the same vein, I've heard the leader of the Conservative Party that you've all spoken about here today, Pierre Poilievre, say that we could actually reduce emissions more globally by exporting natural gas to countries that could then eliminate coal. So you look like you wanted to answer the previous question.
Well, I mean, first of all, Mr. Poilievre often says things that he actually doesn't fully understand. And it's not that straightforward. And in fact, there was a recent study that I think came out of Stanford that actually showed that in the context of the United States and the way in which gas is produced, it's actually worse than coal with respect to overall life cycle emissions. That's not necessarily true in Canada, but it's not true in Canada because we're putting in place methane emissions in the upstream, and we're requiring that when you liquefy natural gas that you do it with clean electricity. So there can be a benefit if you put in place measures that Mr. Poilievre opposes, and if you are ensuring that where you're shipping to it, you're actually displacing coal and you're not displacing renewables. So somebody who believes in climate change can make an argument as to how Canada can do some of that in terms of addressing global emissions on a small scale. But unless you put in place a climate plan, it doesn't work. Your emissions are worse.
Thank you very much. Ça conclut la conférence de presse. That's the end of today's press conference. Thank you.